So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this STARS webinar. I'm Toni SCHOENENBERGER. I'm the Executive Chairman of STARS. And as many of you know, STARS is a global platform for dialogue to discuss developments which will impact our society and our businesses in the next couple of years. In this context, I'm pleased to inform you that we are preparing two symposia in Singapore and in China, and two study tours to China and to Romania. Please visit our website for more information. Now, no doubt, geopolitical, geoeconomic, and geotechnological intelligence is a must for leader in business and society. So today we are continuing our webinar series on Complexity is Destiny, Orientation in Times of No Direction. Today we have the great pleasure to talk to Peter Maurer. Welcome, Peter. Good to have you on this webinar session.
Thanks a lot, Tony. Good to be with you.
Peter Maurer needs no introduction. He is president of the Basel Institute on Governance. Prior to that, Peter was president of the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross. He was Swiss Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs. He was a Swiss ambassador to the United Nations. And today, Peter is also member of the board of directors of Zurich Insurance. In other words, Peter Maurer is a leading voice internationally on humanitarian and related issues. In addition, I'm proud to say Peter is a member of the STARS Global Advisory Panel and a frequent speaker at STARS. So again, Peter, we are very much looking forward to your insights.
Thanks a lot.
We have now 30 minutes to discuss with Peter. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A function below. I have the privilege now to ask a couple of questions first. The title of our webinar series is Complexity is Destiny. And if we look at the world today, a forward-looking tracking of geopolitical, geoeconomic, and geotechnological dynamics is needed. Now, Peter, the general question would be, what worries you most these days?
It's a very difficult question, Tony, because when we discuss complexity, the definition of complexity, that there are many reasons and many factors coming together. And then suddenly, for the purpose of a webinar, you have to decide on what is the top concern and what is key. But reflecting on that, I would say what worries me most, and this may surprise you a little bit because it may not be the usual answer, it's really the decomposition of truth and trust. I do believe that all the other factors that you can mention, mega trends, complicated and complexifying the global international discussions, from climate change to population growth to technological transformation. If we think about the dissolution of liberalism, globalization, multilateralism as a predominant ideology supported by powers, that's an important factor. But if we talk about shifts of cursors in priorities of countries, if we think about the transformation of the international arena, if we think about norms and institutions and how they transform and deconstruct themselves as we move forward, if we think about fragmentation or governance, all these issues somehow go back to the fact that complexity originates not from the fact that these are complicated issues and that they are interrelated, but that the capacity to deal with it is increasingly inhibited by the fact that there is no trust and there is profound disagreement what truth is. And I do believe this is maybe, if we, in all periods of history, there has always been elements of continuity. And sometimes compatriots and contemporary perspective have always somehow privileged the disruptive factor, the new factor. Every generation thinks that what they experience have never been experienced before. And a lot of it is mostly not true because it has been there for a long time. But the fundamental questioning of what is true in the public arena and advocating obviously for untruth in broad scale and with fast and important technologies. This is a big worry, because when there is no truth and trust, then it's very difficult to think on how you approach complexity. And maybe a last thing which speaks to this hypothesis or thesis that I put forward here is my experience in negotiating at the ICRC with parties in conflict. And my experience has shown me, probably somewhere between 2010 and 2020, that there was a shift where I came to a place and trust building was kind of what you tried to do. But then increasingly you realize that trust building is not contributing to trust, because when there is a prevalence of mistrust, then any effort to build trust becomes, again, a complicating factor and an element of generating more mistrust. So I have been in the middle of this conundrum of trust and mistrust and the effort of building trust. And I have experienced, you see, during the Cold War at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, you had thousands of diplomats reflecting on which steps and which measures of transparency can contribute to trust between the East and the West. And that was a professional approach to trust building. Mm-hmm. But when there is so deep mistrust in many places, then this becomes an extremely powerful engine of feeding and accelerating the impression of complexity.
Mm. Very interesting. Thank you. Before turning on to regional conflicts, the following maybe more general questions, particularly also in a world of, you probably wanted to say, of alternative facts. We are seeing crises, wars and tariff wars all over. Is the world really a more dangerous place than ever before?
I mean, the problem with qualifying at a certain period of history the world as more dangerous than before is that we don't have measurement. We can express impressions. And I can speak to the point that probably if we would poll sort of feeling of insecurity because the world is a dangerous place today, we would probably encounter, at least in Western Europe and in the transatlantic area, we would encounter a lot of people who think that the world has become a much more dangerous place. If I do a flashback to where I spent most of the time between 2012 and 22 when I was at the ICRC, I never had the impression that any of these places I visited was considered a safe place by people. And so when I discuss sometimes today the perception of Euro-Atlantics, that the world is becoming a much more dangerous place. People in Africa, Latin America, and some places of Asia, they laugh at me and say, well, it has always been a dangerous place. Welcome to the club. You finally realize what it is to live in a dangerous place. So is the world becoming more dangerous, or are we just normalizing ourselves in the Euro-Atlantic area on a place called world, which has been for a long time, has had all the indicators of danger and crisis and all the red lamps that we know. I find climate change such an interesting challenge on which we are confronted. Every sort of reasonable scientific person tells you that all indicators point in the wrong direction. And when you poll the concern about climate change, concerns are pronounced and increasing overall. And still, the political response to climate change, the generating of measures and politics and actions responding to climate change, is not following up. And so what is dangerous is, of course, this scissor opening between trends which are concerning and the incapability, because of lack of trust and predominant mistrust, to deal with it.
Perhaps we could turn to one or two regional conflicts. Middle East first. I know that you, as the president of the ICRC, you traveled there, you visited, you know all the major figures, politicians, etc. Israel, Palestine, Gaza, and Iran. Can you give us some orientation? What is happening now, and do you have any kind of solution?
Well, I mean, what obviously is happening is that we witness sort of several shifts of cursor in how diplomatic relations and how diplomatic agendas are worked upon. And it is obvious that the use of power and threat of use of force as we experience it today changes the dynamic of the interaction that we have known in the past. And I must say I'm very ambivalent about what we are experiencing in a dynamic like Iran or like Israel-Palestine, because I have been at the forefront of recognizing and acknowledging that the previous multilateral system as we knew it was patently incapable of containing or solving these conflicts. And I'm at the same time a strong believer also in an international system in which we should discuss issues together and we should not have recourse to threat of use of force. That's I agree. I grew up with a culture which believes that this is a good system. And at the same time, I do recognize that disruptive policies, as they have been introduced in particular, but not only, by the United States, and in many respects, the United States have more support, and Donald Trump has more support for disruptive policies worldwide than maybe we would believe. I see some of the positive things that disruption leads to. And so I'm deeply divided in my heart and soul on how we think about these issues. And it is a high-risk enterprise if I look to today's world. It can well be that because of strategically and deliberately introduced disruption, that we move conflicts to a better place, and we move them closer to solution. Non-proliferation in the case of Iran, or coexistence of Palestinians and Israeli. Nobody knows what the consequences of the absurdity of use of force that we have seen in Gaza will end up. And in that sense, I'm deeply divided and also attentive to see, is there a possibility to unblock and solve problems by disruption? Or will we deeply regret in a year from now, when we have burning platforms all over and more killing going on than ever, will we then deeply regret that we didn't stick to a multilateral order and patient diplomacy?
Would you go that far to say that we are seeing the end of the old diplomacy? We are looking for something new platforms. What is the role of the United Nations in the end? What is the multipolar world, etc., etc.?
I do believe, as a historian, institutions, organizations, norms, and principles, they never just dissolve. They have a surprising resilience. And the UN hasn't been abolished. It may be increasingly irrelevant because of new elements coming forward. And they may become relevant again at a certain moment. I have seen organizations called dead or irrelevant, including, as we remember, by the French president, at a certain moment with regard to NATO, or with regard to OSCE, and with regard to the UN. And the same organization a year or 5 years later have been in full spring and have reinvented themselves. So I'm not so sure whether we should declare dead the old system. But what I would recognize is that some of the fundamental principles which have created the world order of 1945, I mentioned before, the sort of abolition of war as a legitimate objective, and the sort of outlawing of the use of force and threat of use of force unless approved by an institution, a multilateral institution. I would agree that this has been sort of pushed aside. This world has been pushed aside by a new practice. Mm-hmm. And the new practice is now what makes headline, which doesn't mean that the old system is dead and completely irrelevant. I can well imagine that we are surprised with a new Secretary General coming in with new ideas and a new approach, and reshaping the tool he has in a new way, and introducing new dynamics. And this is maybe a little bit my history, my historic education and training. I'm not so sure whether history is ever over, and things disappear temporarily in the basement of the museum. But then 50 years later, 20 years later, or even 10 years later, somebody has a good idea. Let's look at this piece of historical experience, and they resurface. And this is what happens in international relations as well. And I think what is so interesting and what passionates me also about the present arena is that somehow things are thinkable which were unthinkable 1 or 2 years ago. And in that sense, I have a much more sort of positive approach to disruption than maybe many other people have. Also because I was used for 10 years to basically be in a disrupted world and to see how resilient people were, how inventive they became, how positive energy emerges from some of the worst places that you can imagine.
In this context, I just saw an article from Parakana, who also did one of the webinar sessions in this webinar series. And the title of it is A World Beyond Trump, Anticipating Geopolitical Futures.
Yeah, I agree with Parag. I think he has a unique gift to put things on the spot. And I do believe what is so important today is the beyond, I would even say beyond in the sense of before and after. The world has fallen apart and has been changing for a long time already, and it will continue to change. And I think the most important thing, maybe for the purpose also of such a webinar, is that we really evacuate from our thinking, that we will go back exactly to the same world that we had before. Even in the best of cases, that many of the principles, norms, institutions, and the whole furniture of international relations that we have created over the last 50 years, even in the best of circumstances, that many of these institutions and norms prevail at the end and still have a function, I would pretend this will be a very different world.
Mm-hmm. We are running out of time, but I would really like to ask one or two questions for the president of the Basel Institute on Governance. We see these amazing developments regarding AI. Obviously, moral, ethical standards are needed, but also accountable governance. What challenges do you anticipate? And this is also a question from Gordana Kirans asking these particular questions on AI and governance.
Look, contrary to probably many of those listening in, I have always to acknowledge that I am not even a digital native. I started my professional career with a typewriting machine which had an ability to change half a line. And so whatever I say may not be the most authoritative opinion, but what I do see today in the different institutions, Toni, that you mentioned at the beginning, and the insights, and if I put it in governance terms, I see kind of two major developments. I do see the standardization, acceleration of the use of artificial intelligence in order to make processes which have already been structured or part of processes in industry, in administration, in institutions, more effective, more efficient, and more impactful. And I think that's the predominant talk that we see in the world and in the headlines, and it's making some of the work we did in the past superfluous, or will rationalize it away, and it causes fears and concerns. And the use of artificial intelligence in these circumstances is really now transforming workplaces governance systems, decision-making systems, because for the amount of reduction of complexity and help and support is enormous. But this is all processes which have been highly structured as well. It's like the electrification of the railway. It's not a new track that is built. But then there is a second point, and I experience it in some of the projects I'm involved in, looking at the interface of human ingenuity, imagination, trust building, leadership concepts, the human judgment, strategic reasoning. And even if I think about my previous task, engaging with difficult interlocutors in conflict regions, I see tens and tens of issues which cannot be solved just by acceleration and systematization of what artificial intelligence brings into structured processes. And I do believe that the big frontier is really, how do we manage, define this interface of human judgment with the tools of artificial intelligence, so that artificial intelligence becomes a support for better human judgment. I mean, it goes a little bit in my optimistic vision that I wanted to convey beforehand. We do have complexities today that we seem almost to be suffocated by, but we have also tools which allow us to deal with complexities which we never had before. And we are in this transition process to learn about these tools, to define their parameters, to see how far they can carry us. And I do believe that it will fundamentally change. Just a parenthesis, I have been interviewed by MIT Harvard project on my experience as negotiator and as a diplomat. And I spent hours in sort of detailing what happens in a negotiation. And it's fascinating to see how researchers build algorithms around something which is a mix of instinct, knowledge, judgment, and I think developing artificial intelligence as a tool which helps us deal with those complex issues is critical. And the last point I wanted to make, we are always at the watertight sort of ambivalence between developing technology which capacitates us to deal with complexity and developing technology which may be used to control individuals and societies and decapacitate them in doing so. And we don't know which part of the equation the coin will fall. And probably it doesn't fall immediately, and probably this is a long process. But that's a little bit where I think the big issues are.
This brings me to the final question. As the president of the ICRC, and also later on and before, you have seen almost everything. The worst humans can do. You met war criminals, etc., etc. How can you still be an optimist?
Well, probably because the job demanded a couple of things. First, most likely an ability which you can train for unprejudiced approaches to people. And Of course, you will find awful behavior, but you will also, when you approach belligerents around the world in an unprejudiced way, you will also enhance your understanding what makes conflict. And you may also start to understand how do you deal with those characters and personalities, not because they are just bad, but because they are what they are in a context in which they operate. And I have learned about the enormous resilience of people, about the imagination to find ways out and better solutions in the worst of circumstances. I think this idea of the Red Cross, that you somehow try in the worst of circumstances to look what is the basic humanity that you can preserve, has kept me enormously optimistic, because I see that there is natural resilience when in worst circumstances. And it has always struck me, and again, I don't want to be misunderstood or idealize, but the strength of people experiencing all these things has shown me that there is hope, that the coin doesn't fall on the control, dominance, dictatorship, misuse part, but people will wish to live decent and dignified lives. And they will, even in worse circumstances, try to carve out a space in which they survive in dignity. And so it's nothing that I can prove. It's nothing scientific. It's an experience, it's an impression, it's a hope with regard to complex situations with which we are dealing. But I think it's a response, at least, or a part response to your question.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, Peter, time is up. First, I really want to thank you very, very much for your brilliant insights. You made us think over the weekend, probably. So we are facing disruptions all over. And again, orientation from you is really needed. So thank you very much again for this orientation. We wish you all the best. And we are very much looking forward to having you again at STARS. Thank you very much.
Thanks to all of you. And thanks to you, Toni, for the interview.
This is the end of our webinar series on Complexity's Destiny. All the webinars are recorded and available on our website. We are starting a new webinar series entitled It's the Economy, Stupid. The first speaker will be Mark Dietli. He's the co-founder and financial journalist of The Market, based in Zurich, Switzerland. This will be on 12th of March. So we hope to see you then. Goodbye for now. Thank you.